So our next speaker needs no introduction. Lowkey is an internationally acclaimed rapper and activist. He has worked with Immortal Technique, Wretch 32, Akala, Dead Prez, and Outlaws. He is part of the supergroup Mongrel alongside members of the Arctic Monkeys, Baby Shambles, and Reverend and the Makers. The band released their album Better Than Heavy in tandem with the independent newspaper. So, Lowkey, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. It is great to be here. Now, we know that and thank you very much for the introduction. It's absolutely vital, the work that Kat does, and it's an honor to be here in support of it. Now, we know that the Festival of Death, which is taking place in East London, is run by an organization called Clarion Events, which is led by the ex-RAF officer, Simon Kimball. It's hosting 1,600 companies. Now, the company that owns Clarion Events is the Blackstone Group. In 2018, when there was an outpouring of condemnation in the United States following several school shootings of the organizations and companies that are involved in the selling of weapons in the US, Blackstone Group actually put out a statement saying, we believe that we have next to no direct exposure to the firearms industry. Well, today, a company which is owned by Blackstone is hosting these 1,600 companies, which not only sell guns, they sell bombs, they sell fighter jets, they sell warships to buyers from over 100 different states. And the problem we are in this country is that those companies who are part of this festival of death, essentially, are considered more likely to be the constituents of our political elite than we are. And the projection of violence around the world, unfortunately, seems to be pretty much part of the DNA of our economy. When we look at Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, for example, he was, of course, the overseas director of Kinetic. It's an arms company that made billions out of the occupation of Afghanistan, not only through weapon sales to the MOD, to the US military, but also to the Dutch military, despite the fact there isn't meant to be a Dutch military. He's also someone that in 2016 and 2017 received payments from a lobbying organization, Squire Patton Boggs. Now, Squire Patton Boggs' director is James Thompson, who previously worked as an in-house legal representative of BAE Systems. And Squire Patton Boggs was employed and was under contract to BAE Systems as a lobbyist for them during the time these payments were received by Ben Wallace. These donations were received. The contract didn't end until 2018. In my opinion, questions should be asked, not only about his role as overseas director at Kinetic, what it actually consisted of, but whether he had any shares in the company, and also what was the reason for these donations from Squire Patton Boggs when he received them. We look at Theresa May, for example. Her husband, Philip May, works for Capital Group. Capital Group was one of the largest owners of Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems during the war on terror. Of course, it's well known that Lockheed Martin stocks increased in value by 1,235% across the war on terror. 37 million people were displaced by this war. And not only did Lockheed Martin benefit massively from this massive projection of violence, but they also were a key part of the militarization of borders in the United States and the EU. So the very same organizations that benefited from creating the conditions in which people have to flee also benefit from keeping those people out of places like the EU and the United States. When we look at the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, he was previously a partner at the Children's Investment Fund, which owned Lockheed Martin and also owned another company by the name of Safran. Safran owns has a subsidiary which owns a company called Securimetrics. Now, Securimetrics was the company through which the United States attempted to extract the biometric data of 80% of the Afghan population throughout this occupation. So meaning that Rishi Sunak was a partner at the hedge fund, which partly owned Lockheed Martin and partly owned this other company. These are important relationships that unfortunately have received very little, if in fact no mention in the mainstream media. And it extends to looking at someone like Tony Blair. You know, he's paid around £1 million a year as an international advisor to the UAE-based company Al Mubadala Development Fund. And Mubadala was, of course, seen to be developing a plan to mine $1 trillion worth of resources from Afghanistan. You look at organizations like Serco, another one, you know, the grandchildren of Winston Churchill, the CEO of Serco, Rupert Soames. He is the partner of Camilla Soames, who is a Tory party donor. They also have a Tory health minister, Edward Agrar, formerly lobbying for Serco also, but Serco were essential in providing logistics and base support services to the Australian Army in Afghanistan. They also were involved in the MOD's Skynet 5 program, buttressing the communication system across the world that the MOD has. But also when it came time to give contracts for dismantling the military bases, those contracts went to Serco, which, as we've demonstrated, is very closely linked to the Tory government. Of course, Rupert Soames's brother is a former Tory MP and now sits in the House of Lords. The security at this festival of death that we have spoken about is carried out by G4S. Now, G4S also benefits from £600 million of contracts from the British government annually. It's also taken 10 million in coronavirus support from the government and is believed to have an annual revenue of £7.5 billion. As a paid position at G4S, you have John Reid, who's a former Secretary of Defence in the British government. You also have the former prison governor, Tom Wheatley, also in a paid position at G4S. Again, this is another company that has been involved in the benefiting from war. Now, when we look at the two key controversial points of British policy when it comes to weapons sales, those are very clearly the state of Israel and Saudi Arabia. They have received the most legal challenge and are the most controversial. Obviously, vast majority of Britain's weapons sales do go to the Gulf. But when we look at the connection with the state of Israel, it does go back to a figure by the name of Chaim Weizmann. He worked for the British government. You know, as we know, in World War I, there was an organization called the Nobel Dynamite. It was kind of a conglomerate of, I think it was 4 German arms companies and 3 British arms companies together. And what happened was those companies for the first 2 years of World War I would pool their resources and put together their funds, meaning that you had German arms companies profiting from German deaths and British arms companies profiting from British deaths. Now, after that was cut off, the British government became increasingly reliant on Chaim Weizmann's method of producing acetone for weapons by using sources of starch. And that brought him closer to the British government. Churchill at the time was the Lord of the Admiralty, and he was later replaced by Arthur Balfour. And Lloyd George at that time was Minister of munitions. Later on, Chaim Weizmann strengthened his relationship with the British government to the point where he procured the Balfour Declaration from the Lloyd George Prime Minister government and the Arthur Balfour Foreign Minister. We also know that on the two sides of the Zionist movement, from the Ben-Gurion side to the Vladimir Jabotinsky side, both of them were trained as part of a special battalion in the British Army in World War I. You then had Herbert Samuel in his role as the first High Commissioner of the British Mandate of Palestine, laying the foundations really for the apartheid state through legislating the implementation of the Balfour Declaration, establishing separate institutions for different parts of the population. It was then 1936 when the Palestinians established the longest strike in recorded human history in order to squash the strike. General Order Wingate and others from the British Army helped to organize Zionist fighters. They used Palestinians as minesweepers. Again, this is a tactic which has later been echoed by the Israelis, using Palestinians as human shields in some cases. They demolished houses for punitive reasons. You saw 2,000 Palestinian homes destroyed by the British during that period from 1936 to 1940. And again, this is something that Israel does today. In 1967, Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank could not have taken place without Harold Wilson selling hundreds of Centurion tanks to Israel. Also in 1973, as is looked at in the amazing book Balfour's Shadow from David Cronin, you see that the UK Atomic Energy Authority actually undertook joint research with the state of Israel. How much was gleaned from that process and how much benefit Israel derived from it is unknown, but we do know that Israel is not honest about its nuclear weapons that are worked on in Dimona, in Palestine. You also have today what we're talking about when we talk about this relationship between Britain and Israel in terms of weapons of war. You have 10 different sites for the Israeli arms company Elbit Systems across Britain, 6 subsidiary companies of Elbit Systems here. Remember that Israel per capita is the largest arms exporter in the world. You know, that's in relation to its population, obviously. Drones for the IDF are produced by UAV Tactical Systems in Leicester. This is a subsidiary of Elbit Systems. You also have the engines for some of the drones being made near Birmingham. On top of that, BAE Systems has worked in collaboration with the Israeli arms company Rafael on the naval drones, which are essential to the siege of Gaza, which by many different institutions have denounced that siege as illegal. Obviously, Lockheed Martin manufacture the F-16, which Israel has used in many of its campaigns against the Palestinian population in Gaza, but BAE Systems participate in the building of that F-16 by contributing the HUD technology, which is used for targeting. Now, while it's being replaced by the F-35 gradually, the F-35 has been the most expensive military project in human history. The rear section of the F-35 is built by BAE Systems in tandem with Lockheed Martin and Arconic. Now, when David Miliband was asked after the 2009 Operation Cast Lead, in which over 1,400 Palestinians were killed, whether British components had been used in the killings in Gaza, he replied, almost certainly. Today, you have more than 100 different companies in this country selling military equipment to the state of Israel. The communities that some of these factories are part of are quite clear that, you know, when you look at somewhere like Leicester, you have a high proportion of the population who would also be opposed to the Indian occupation of Kashmir. And Elbit Systems also sell weapons to the Indian state for use in Kashmir. Even when you look at the Great March of Return, which saw Palestinians attempting to practice their right under UN Resolution 194 and attempting to return home, snipers were used against those Palestinians. Many people were killed, and also thousands were badly injured. Some of them had to have their legs amputated. Ibrahim Abu Thuraya was, of course, a very prominent example. This was somebody who had lost his legs previously from, as far as I understand, Israeli violence. He was somebody who was on a wheelchair and was killed by Israel on this Great March of Return. Now, Britain, prior to the Great March of Return, had sold sniper components to the State of Israel, and since that had happened, had also made sales. When we look at the other controversial point of British arms policy, we see in Yemen the poorest people in the world being killed by the richest states in the region, backed by some of the richest countries in the world. That is the Saudi coalition, which includes the UAE and others. Evidence has been found that around a third of all of the coalition strikes have hit civilian targets. You're talking about a place where 10 million people face famine, where 80% of the population are deemed to be in need of humanitarian assistance. You know, that equates to about 24 million people. You've got the rates of acute malnutrition among children under 5 are some of the highest ever recorded. 98,000 children who are under the age of 5 deemed to be at risk of dying without urgent treatment. 250,000 pregnant or breastfeeding women deemed to be at risk of dying without urgent treatment. According to Save the Children, for every one child who has been killed in bombings or shot, dozens are starving to death in Yemen. We can't forget that starvation is also a war crime, the depriving of civilians of objects which are indispensable to their survival. And the Saudi coalition has blocked ports like Hodeidah, which something like 85% of Yemen's imports come through. You've seen the bombing of farms, you've seen the bombing of the sanitation system. During this period, BAE Systems has sold over 15 billion pounds worth of arms to the Saudi government. They're the biggest buyer of UK weapons. So you've got these fighter jets, which are made in Britain, being driven by pilots who have been trained by and often in Britain, dropping bombs which have been made in Britain, from tornadoes and typhoon jets, the Pavley missiles, Brimstone missiles. They're all made here in this country. And it wasn't really until the Daily Mail revealed the death of some special forces soldiers, the wounding of British special forces soldiers in Yemen, that it became clear that also British military personnel are active on the ground in Yemen. And a worker in BAE Systems in maintenance was asked how long the campaign could last without British support, and he said, if we weren't here working on these jets in Saudi, it would probably be between 7 to 14 days, and there wouldn't be one jet in the sky. As I said, you know, these coalition airstrikes have hit markets, funerals, weddings, detention facilities, civilian boats, medical facilities. The cholera outbreak in 2016 was preceded by the targeting of the sewer and sanitation system in Yemen by the British-supported Saudi coalition. You also look at the fact that, you know, it's believed that British-made cluster bombs, which were sold to Saudi Arabia in the 80s, have been used in Yemen and are currently deemed to be illegal under international law. And all of this is happening, all of this involvement is happening, but yet only 49% of the British public know that the war even exists in Yemen. And this is the key part that education comes into the situation, because what you have sitting as the chair of the Defence Committee, which supposedly interrogates MOD policy, is Tobias Ellwood. Now, Tobias Ellwood is a lieutenant in the British Army's Psychological Warfare Unit, 77th Brigade, As a politician, he has received donations from the Saudi government and the Conservative Friends of Israel. Does that sound like a neutral arbiter, or even someone who doesn't have a conflict of interest when we're talking about these very issues? And the criteria when it comes to granting export licenses are quite clear. When it comes to the arms trade, it says, if there is a clear risk that weapons might be used in a serious violation of international law, then those arms should not be sold. Now, the work that Kat has done on this has been absolutely fantastic, really so important, and it can't be underestimated. In 2017, they took this case to the High Court in Britain and unfortunately lost. But in 2018, when they appealed, and eventually it was heard in 2019, they won. And it was deemed that British policy, when considering all of the things that the Saudis had done that were well evidenced by very reputable organizations, that the selling of arms to Saudi in that context was unlawful and irrational. Liam Fox had said at the time that there were something like 57 arms licenses waiting to be given approval. And for that reason, clearly you see here that the winning of that case in the Court of Appeal would have blocked those. There's also some fighter jets that the Saudis have been trying to procure from the British government for a long time, that these legal bumps in the road have definitely had a key role in preventing. But then later on, the government started again in its arms sales to Saudi on the 7th of July 2020, claiming that they had a sort of revised methodology to their decision-making process. And in fact, the trade minister, Liz Truss at the time, claimed that there was no pattern of behavior, the implication being that these seemingly serious violations of international humanitarian law were some kind of aberration. Liz Truss, we can't forget Liz Truss, as an MP, has received donations from the American Enterprise Institute, which is a well-known right-wing neocon think tank, which is funded by ExxonMobil, Koch brothers, among other corporate interests. Throughout this whole period, you've seen Yemen go through the COVID pandemic with more than half of its health facilities either damaged or not functioning. You've seen hundreds of times that farms have been targeted. You've seen Muwatana actually has documented over 120 attacks on health facilities and their staff over 45 months. You've seen the bombing of refugee camps, as I said, weddings, funerals, hospitals, farms, and even a school bus. So we're really in a situation today where the mythology around the arms trade, we are told that, and I think it's important that we mention that in Liverpool, the resistance which is being put up against another festival of death taking place there, Massive Attack have cancelled their gig in the same venue, but Unite the Union also have an event taking place in the same venue and have not cancelled it. Now, Unite members voted to apply BDS 10 years ago. That's boycott, divestment, and sanctions, meaning that they wouldn't sell weapons to the state of Israel anymore. It's just one of those things. And Unite have still not implemented that very basic call from their membership. I think it's absolutely important that in a situation where you could possibly have members of Unite working in factories, building some of the weapons that are then being sent to the state of Israel for use on Palestinians, to put pressure on this important union and try to organize and mobilize around changing that policy. But also when we look at a lot of the mythology around the arms trade and how important it is for creating jobs, I think a very key part of the story is the Lucas plan, and people need to examine what happened there, because you had workers at an arms company by the name of Lucas Aerospace who approached Tony Benn, and there had been a lot of cuts and job losses in the company, and they said to Tony Benn, can you nationalize us and secure our jobs? And Tony Benn said, if you can come back to me with a list of alternative contraptions that you can make other than arms. And they went away and collated a list of hundreds of contraptions that they could make rather than weapons with the expertise that they had. Among them were dialysis machines, and it was at a time when people were dying from the shortage of dialysis machines in Britain. Some of them were hybrid engines, things that are really quite run of the mill in British society today. There were a whole dearth of different contraptions that they'd come up with. Unfortunately, in the end, though, the Labour Party, as it often does, let them down majorly. But the point being made there was that these very same skills that people have built up can, must, and will eventually be applied to different, more socially useful contraptions that can help push us forward as humanity. And when we look also at the studies that have been done, looking at every $1 billion that is invested in the arms trade, equating to about 11,000 jobs. Well, if you were to take that same $1 billion and invest it in clean energy, for example, you'd get about 16,000 jobs. If you were to take that same $1 billion and invest it in healthcare, you'd get about 19,000 jobs. And for that same billion invested in the arms trade, if you invested it in education, you'd get about 26,000 jobs. And so it's really important for us now to take on and discredit a lot of the mythology that buttresses what is essentially a misallocation of funds. And it's absolutely vital that those in East London right now who are leading the resistance against this festival of death make clear that while Robin Cook said that BAE Systems has the keys to 10 Downing Street, it certainly doesn't have the keys to London. People have been successful before in chasing away these arms fairs. Australia is a perfect example, but also Bristol, Birmingham, Cardiff, and Glasgow, you have also seen other important successes. When we think about the 11-year struggle, which was waged at Greenham Common, which was at one point home to 96 nuclear missiles, the Ministry of Defense said that those nuclear missiles would quietly melt into the countryside. It was supposed to be a little piece of the United States in the south of England, replete with baseball pitches and other key signifiers of US culture. However, an 11-year camp of fantastic women activists cutting their way into the base, disrupting the movement of power. Eventually today, you see the poetic justice of what happened at Greenham Common is that the base is no longer there, the nuclear weapons are no longer there, but there is a plaque remembering the women's movement, which resisted so fantastically at Greenham Common. And so taking all of these things into account is absolutely vital that we work on creating the mechanisms of education about this misallocation of funds within our society. And we state absolutely clearly that there are better and more important places that we can put this resource to help all of humanity rather than harm anyone.
Thank you so much for that, Kareem. As always, really beautiful to hear you speak. And really kind of reminded me of something that I said earlier, and also something that was said on Wednesday during the DSEI Education Day. And that's what we're protesting and the weapons being advertised at the Excel Center right now are not abstract symbols of conflict. They are the literal murder weapons that are being used against our communities across the globe. And it's really important that we hold that, and that we don't turn this into an abstract discussion around conflict. We need to stop these murder weapons from being sold. And the situation is as absolute and as dire as that. Kareem, I don't know if you're like available to do any questions, but I think
Yeah, of course, no problem.
if people want to ask questions, then yeah, feel free, people.
Do we have any questions in the chat? I'm seeing some things written, but maybe it's no questions.
I'm not sure. I'm having a look. No, these are all from staff, so we'll give people a moment to see if they want to ask anything. I guess I've got a question for you, Kareem, in the meantime, and that's how do you envision this work taking place in our education system, and what do you envision for our education to be freed from the shackles of the arms trade and militarism?
Well, I think if you look at some of BAE Systems advertising, the Engineering Fairy Tales series, which directly targets children and uses stories like Hansel and Gretel. So, for example, the video advert for BAE Systems, which uses Hansel and Gretel, has a currently serving British Army soldier reading a kind of imaginary version of Hansel and Gretel, where they're working on STEM stuff for BAE Systems. So what we need to do is we need to be very clear about these equations with young people in schools. You know, the fantastic documentary War School also goes into the way in which young children are being very seriously targeted. You also look at the example of the Trojan horse, largely manufactured scandal in Birmingham. The interesting thing about it was the school that previously had been very high achieving and was shut down because of this manufactured scandal. What happened was the school that opened up in its stead was one of the first schools to host the British Army on campus as a sort of in-house unit. And so we have to be very, very clear and organized against the militarization of education and kind of step into and stop that school to military pipeline. I'm of the belief that the Operation Legacy program, which encompassed many different agencies of British state, which was the organized obscuring of the historical record of Britain's role in around 37, if I remember correctly, colonies. This was at the point of independence. The British government employees had clear instructions to either sink, burn, or hide documents or take them back to Britain and hide them in Hanslope Park if they met one of 4 criteria. And those criteria included that they could be used by future governments to embarrass the British government, or to, be used irresponsibly. What we understand as be used irresponsibly would probably be used for legal action later on down the line. And so it's my belief that Operation Legacy, while it wasn't only applied in that way, it was really essentially applied to our curriculums in school. We're not leaving our education with an understanding that Britain occupied 14 million miles of the globe. It ruled over hundreds of millions of people, that Britain didn't have an empire, Britain was an empire, that from 1949, British Nationality Act, people had the right from all outer reaches of the British Empire to performed their birthright by coming to Britain. They were British citizens. It wasn't until the Commonwealth Act in 1962 that that changed. So our kind of understanding of what Britain is not given to young people, unfortunately. And I think for that reason, it makes it harder to really understand how this place, which has, you know, limited natural resources in terms of human resources, is limited in terms of land mass. Now, depending how you put it, you know, if you include the sort of network of overseas tax havens, if you include some other stuff, but you know, then the land mass would slightly change, but generally it's challenged really in terms of land mass. This country should never have been the world's #1 economy. It shouldn't be the 5th largest economy. It's due to fall out of the top 10 largest economies in the world. And at the same time, the 20 fastest growing economies, none of them in Europe, and several of them are former British colonies. So Britain being the world's #2 largest arms exporter is definitely part of the sort of residue of British Empire, much like the tax havens are. And it's a way really for the British military to have access to other countries' infrastructure also. And so while we see the decline of Britain, the inevitable decline of Britain economically, I do believe that the arms trade will be one of those things, but it will also be kind of one of the last things to go, but it will also decline at the same time. So I think it's, you know, there was a time when the CND, for example, got into British schools and were able to really talk to students about the issue of nuclear disarmament. But we're at a time where we've had 20 years of the war on terror. We've had Prevent getting £50 million of public funding every year. And as I say, we've got the army in schools in a more increased and intense way. So we have to kind of organize around these things and set up, even outside of the schools, in a face-to-face community kind of way, organizations that work around this issue of militarism. Because if you look at the Palestine Action operations in Leicester during the recent Palestinian uprising, you saw for 6 days an Elbit Systems factory shut down, 6 consecutive days. And the only reason that that happened for as long as it did was because the local community in Leicester came out very clearly and unambiguously in support of this action. And so this is what we have to tease out. We have to encourage and cultivate a criticality in the communities that these factories exist in, and make clear to people that they also don't have any interest in these factories doing what they do there. And as is the case in Leicester, there's many people that wouldn't have known that this company that has a factory there were also involved in what was happening in Kashmir. So it's important to kind of build that, I would say.
Thank you for that, Kareem. I'm going to ask one more question. It's a question from the audience member, and then we'll go into our closing session. So this question is from Robert, and he said, you've mentioned Prevent. As an employee working in a school, what do you think are the best ways to challenge Prevent in education?
Well, as far as I understand, already in public institutions, people have a duty of care to the people within them. Therefore, if they know that somebody is going to do something that's going to harm someone, it's already their responsibility to pass on that information. What Prevent does, unfortunately, is encourage people to act in what seems to me a violation of the 2010 Equalities Act, which says you can't discriminate against a person for political belief or religious belief. And so what Prevent is asking people that work in public institutions, but also now in private companies like Tesco, like McDonald's, like River Island, who have signed up to Prevent also, it's trying to get them to do 2 contradictory things at the same time. So I think, as I'm not in the position of somebody that's working in one of these institutions, and I know that from institution to institution, the types of pressure that will be applied differ. There are some places where Prevent is not such a stringent orthodoxy, but there are other places where there can be quite serious consequences. And, you know, it's a statutory duty now. So I think it would definitely be context specific in the way that you can organize and contradict the prevent policy, but it's also about being clear about this. You are already obliged under the duty of care to do certain things. You do not have to apply stuff like prevent, which has a clear tone to it, which targets certain people and also opens the space for some pretty totalitarian kind of stuff, which is the allowing of children to be questioned by police without the presence or foreknowledge of any of those kids' parents. And I think that that is a major problem. And if we purport to be a society which values ideals such as freedom of expression, then surely the freedom of expression of the child should be something that is really sacred. And also it's this way of sort of understanding children deemed by the state to be Muslim in a sort of algorithmatized way that maybe, you know, some of the criteria under prevent are just truly ridiculous. If a child changes their haircut unusually, if a child is often late to class, if a child is not talkative in class, if a child is talkative in class, if someone in one of these public institutions gets tattoos suddenly. There's so many different things, and the scope is being given so wide that it's basically state sanctioned political and religious discrimination as far as I'm concerned. So the things that you can do to contradict it will all be good, you know, whatever you can do.